Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event with Dr. Elaine Pagels of Princeton University. We have attendees joining us from a variety of locations and even countries today, which is amazing. It's one of the great benefits of the tech advancements that have been made in the past few years. But I'd like to start by acknowledging the land where I personally am sitting today here in Alberta, at the University of Alberta's Augustana campus. This land, where the campus is located, is traditionally known as Asiniskau-Sapisis, or Stony Creek. It is in Treaty 6 territory and is a traditional meeting ground for many Indigenous peoples. The land provided a traveling route and home to the Musqueam, Nahiwak, Niitsitapi, Nakota, and Tsuut'ina nations, the Métis, and other Indigenous peoples. Their spiritual and practical relationships to the land create a rich heritage for our learning and our life as a community here at the university. Again, welcome to our event tonight. My name is Ian Wilson. I teach religious studies here at the University of Alberta, and I direct the Chester Ronning Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life. For those of you who may not be familiar with the center and its work, we aim to facilitate interdisciplinary research, critical teaching, ethical reflection, and public programming on a range of issues in relation to religious communities, practices, and ideas. One of the ways we work toward accomplishing this goal is to bring distinguished scholars to the university for events like this one. Normally, of course, we host our distinguished visitors in person, and that was the original plan for this series of events, both tonight's and tomorrow's. Unfortunately, given the timing of the university's opening of campuses this semester, we weren't able to arrange for Dr. Pagels to join us here on site. We are nearly at the point, we hope, when we'll be able to return fully to in-person events on campus. But for now, we are grateful, nevertheless, to be able to continue offering this kind of programming despite the ongoing challenges of the pandemic. So I thank you all for signing in tonight online. I know that most of you are pros at Zoom and the webinar format by now, but just a quick reminder that you may submit questions for our guest tonight at any point during the event by using the Q&A feature in your Zoom app. We'll have time for questions and responses at the end of the talk, so please submit your questions as they come to mind, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible. And now to the main event. Among those who have an interest in the history of Christianity, our guest tonight really needs no introduction, and I know that it's cliche to say that, but in this case, it is definitely true. Dr. Elaine Pagels, the Harrington Spear Payne Foundation Professor of Religion at Princeton, has had a monumental impact on our understanding of the earliest Christian communities and texts in the ancient world. At Harvard, during her doctoral studies, she began working with a collection of ancient texts, a cache of secret gospels that were discovered in Egypt in 1945, but which were still largely unknown at the time of her studies. After earning her PhD, she would go on to work with an international team of scholars to translate and publish these texts, work which has fundamentally changed how scholars think and talk about Christian history. But the impact of her work has reached well beyond the academy, which is what makes her a truly outstanding academic and a fitting guest for the Ronning Center. Her New York Times best-selling book, The Gnostic Gospels, introduced these texts and their import to the general public. In it, she argues that the teachings of Jesus, as portrayed in these texts, mirror mystical Jewish traditions that would have been familiar to a first-century rabbi, and that it was only later Christian bishops who denounced and destroyed these teachings as, quote, heresy. The book went on to win a National Book Award, a National Book Critics Circle Award, and in 1999, the Modern Library named it as one of the 100 best nonfiction books published in English in the 20th century. A lesser scholar would probably be content at that point to rest on one's laurels, but Dr. Pagels has continued to write and publish influential articles and best-selling books throughout her career. Her research has ranged from sex and politics in early Christianity to how the figure of Satan has functioned in Christian prejudice and anti-Semitism, to apocalyptic visions and the Book of Revelation. On each of these topics, she has furthered our academic knowledge and our public understanding. In recognition of these significant contributions, in 2013, she received an honorary doctorate from Harvard. And in 2016, she received the National Medal for the Humanities from US President Barack Obama. Her most recent work, which I have right here, Why Religion, was published in 2018 and went on to become yet another bestseller. In this book, she asks why religion persists today, and she gives an account of her own life as a scholar of religion. Tonight, this topic, Why Religion, is the title of her talk and is also the subject. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about her story as a scholar of religion and her work. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Pagels to the University of Alberta. There we go. I think we have you now. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Excellent. Welcome, Dr. Pagels. And it's so good to have you and to see you here. And I will disappear now and the screen will be yours.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Wilson, for that generous welcome. And I thank my colleagues at the University of Alberta. I wish I could be there with you in person, but at least we can do this. And I'm really happy that we can talk about this most recent book. I'll talk about it for a while, and I hope then we'll open up a discussion. So the book was called Why Religion? A Personal Story. And it's not like anything else I've ever written. Because as Ian Wilson said, it's not just about what we study, but it's about how a person's life coincides with that particular work. And it does in a very powerful way, in my experience. So the title, Why Religion? That was a question I was asking myself. And someone who read the book said, but you don't answer that question. And I wanted to say, no, that's a programmatic question. That's a question that's been motivating everything I've been doing for all these years. And there are different parts of that question. There are different ways to ask it. One of the ones is, why is religion still around? What purpose does it serve? These various questions about why is religion still around in the 21st century? I need to change the wheel. Okay. There we go. Sorry. So the first question, why is religion still around in the 21st century, comes out of growing up in a family which wasn't particularly religious. I mean, we were culturally Christian. My mother took me to a little Methodist church in the town in Palo Alto where we lived. There was a picture of Jesus that looked like this on the wall. But my father had been brought up in a family that was intensely Presbyterian, and he came to really dislike the ferocity of that tradition and the way it made people argue. So as soon as he met Darwin, who's on the other side of Jesus here, he quit religion altogether and said, that is just for uneducated people. As soon as you understand science, you don't need it. Religion is obsolete. So I was brought up being told there was no room for religion in the future, certainly among educated people. So what I happened to love growing up was poetry. On here on the left is John Donne, who's one of the wonderful poets in English. I came to love dance, the dances of the Hopi in Santa Fe, the dances of Alvin Ailey's company in New York, music from Aretha Franklin to Bach. And all of this was just intensely powerful. It sort of took me into a kind of other dimension of experience that ordinary life didn't. But I didn't know anything at that point about religion, particularly. Until I was in high school, some of my friends in Palo Alto said they were going to San Francisco for the day and would I come with them? And I thought, sure, why not? I didn't know we were going to hear somebody called Billy Graham or that he was a famous evangelist or anything about that at all. So we ended up in the sports stadium. You see here a picture of 18,000 people packed into the place where ordinarily you'd go to see a baseball game. And this fiery preacher got up and started to speak in a very intense, passionate, serious way. And at the end of his preaching, he issued an invitation. He said, you can be born again. You can transform your life. You can start over. You can join the family which belongs to God and start all over. And I was, 14 or 15, and that was an irresistible invitation. So I just went down with thousands of other people as the choir was singing a glorious hymn, powerfully moved, and went up to the altar and was saved. My parents actually were horrified by this, but I found it to be a very remarkable experience. So the first answer to why religion, I would say for me, was because we need it, or some of us need it more than others. And so if people say, what purpose does it serve? One thing it does is it opened up a kind of other dimension. I felt as though I'd been living almost in a flat world, and that suddenly it opened into 3 dimensions or maybe more. And it was open to the cosmos. It was open to the drama of good and evil in the world. It was a drama that involved human beings, but wasn't limited to the human world. It involved the imagination. It involved a spiritual dimension that to me was new and powerfully important. But when people talked about why do people argue so much about the questions it raises, people talk about religion causing dissension and even war, I think it's because the questions that are raised in that context, when you're thinking about ultimate meaning, can't be solved by rational discussion. It can't be solved by scientific evidence. Those questions move through us on huge currents of emotional intensity. And that's what happened to me. And that's what jolted me out of the evangelical church group that I joined at Peninsula Bible Church in Palo Alto. I belonged to that church and worshiped with the group my age for about a year, passionately. But at a certain moment, there was a crisis. One of my close friends in high school was in an automobile accident and was killed in the accident. He was 16 years old. And the rest of us involved in that accident were profoundly shocked and shaken. And I went back to the evangelical church and I said, this terrible thing has happened. And they said, oh, that's awful. Was he born again? And I said, no, he was Jewish. And they looked at me and they said, well, then he's in hell. I felt like someone socked me in the stomach. I was so shocked. And I thought that has nothing to do with the love of God. That's what I thought this was about. But at that point, that particular group, that particular incident, it was not about the love of God. It was not about opening to a spiritual dimension. And I walked out of there feeling desolated and never went back. So after that, I joined the group of other friends I had, who, all of whom were artists, musicians, would-be artists, poets, musicians. All of us wanted to do something dramatic and creative. And after a few years, I was in love with modern dance, which I did some when I was in college. And I went off to New York City to study modern dance. And all I knew from California was the Martha Graham School, because it was a pretty provincial place where I lived. But I went to the Martha Graham School. This is a picture of the classes at that school. And it was wonderful. But after about a year, I realized that wanting to be a professional dancer in New York was not going to work for me, because many of these others had started when they were 8 or 5. And I just thought, okay, I'm pretty good, but I'm not that good. And this is not something I can do in the way that I'd hoped. So I had to think about a plan B. And at that point, it was years after I'd left the evangelical group. But I kept thinking, what was it about that experience? Was it Christianity, or could it have been Buddhism? Could it have been another religious tradition that opened up the universe in a way that secular life doesn't? But I wanted to understand what had sort of hit me in that experience. So I decided to go off to a university, one of the only ones that had a graduate program in the study of religion, and you could study Hinduism or Judaism or Buddhism or Christianity. And so I went there, and this is a picture of that old school in Cambridge. This is my first advisor. His name was Christer Stendhal, and I thought he was quite ferocious when I met him. He was a Swedish Archbishop of Sweden, Lutheran. And he kind of looked at me fiercely and he said, "All right, so why did you come here?" And I mumbled something about, well, I wanted to learn about the essence of Christianity. And he looked at me severely, as he often did, and he said, "How do you know it has an essence?" And I thought, wow, that's a good question. I've never thought about that. And it made me think in a totally new way. So I knew I was in the right place. But I knew even more I was in the right place when suddenly I discovered that our professors had access to the greatest discovery, not of the century, of the last 2,000 years in what we know about the history of Christianity. Because in Upper Egypt, about the same year that the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in Israel, which revolutionized the way we understand Judaism in the time of Jesus, there was found a whole library of secret texts, unknown early Christian texts in Upper Egypt, up by Luxor, in this cave near an old monastery in Egypt. What was found was a huge jar, and in the jar were 13 books bound in leather and 51 texts from the early Christian world. And my dear teacher, Christer Stendhal, said, well, we just thought these gospels were weird, but there were 5 gospels included and many others that spoke about Jesus and his apostles. Well, they were weird, but now they're telling us so much we never knew about the early Christian movement. What we used to know is kind of a narrow stream of what Orthodox Christianity allowed to flow down to the 21st century. But now we know that there was a lot more going on that we never knew about. When I first opened one of these texts, it was the Gospel of Thomas. And this saying, I came upon this saying. Jesus said, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. I was stunned and I thought, wow, You don't have to believe that, but there's truth there. It struck me deeply. I knew that we weren't supposed to like these Gospels. This is a picture of a famous bishop in the 2nd century. Bishop Irenaeus, he's known as the great founder of Christian Orthodoxy. And he wrote against people he called heretics. And he said this: the heretics say they have lots more Gospels, but their Gospels are nothing but insanity and blasphemy. So he worked very hard to have other bishops destroy those texts, get rid of them, trash them, and condemn them. I was fascinated by these texts, as you said. And so I wrote a little book about them, first book that was publicly written about them, the Gnostic Gospels. And the person who reviewed them in the New York Times said basically what the bishop had said 2,000 years before. These were rubbish in the 1st century. They're still garbage. And then there's the question, how could these be secret teaching of Jesus anyway? Did Jesus ever teach secretly? Well, the famous bishop who basically discarded these texts said, no, Jesus never taught secretly. He only taught publicly. We know his public preaching. It's in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And actually, the secret Gospel of Thomas has half of the same sayings in it. It's just a list of sayings. There's no story. There's just a list of sayings of Jesus. And some of them are identical with what you find in Matthew and Luke, like the parable of the mustard seed, the parable of someone finding a treasure in a field, love your brother, sayings like that, very familiar. But was there secret teaching? A professor at Oxford said, who knew a lot about the 1st century Jewish community, said, if Jesus taught the way other rabbis did, yes, he probably did offer secret teaching. And then if you read the earliest gospel we've got, it's the Gospel of Mark in the New Testament, it says, yes, Jesus offered secret teaching only to his disciples. He never let outsiders know what he said. And the Gospel of Mark says he did that, but Mark doesn't tell you what he said. He just says, well, yes, he did that, but he reports only the public teaching. But unlike Mark's Gospel now in the New Testament, the Gospel of Thomas, which we had just found for the first time in 2,000 years, a copy of this text, with sayings of Jesus that do claim to reveal the secret of the kingdom of God. And in this text, what Jesus says, when in the beginning of the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, if your leaders say to you, look, kingdom is up in the sky, then the birds will get there first. If they say it's in the ocean, the fish will get there first. Now, this is sort of irony, right? You say, look, it's not a place. It's not up there. It's not down there. It's not a place you can find in space. And it's not an event in time. It's not something that's just coming at the end of time. Instead, this gospel, Jesus says what he also says in Luke. In Luke, the saying is, the kingdom of God is within you. The Gospel of Thomas amplifies the same saying. The kingdom of God is within you. And when you come to know yourself, then you will know that you are the children of the living God. The disciples here, as also in the New Testament, they don't get it. So they keep saying, when is the kingdom going to come? When is the end of time? And Jesus here says, what? Do you know what the beginning is about? Why do you keep looking at the end? Go back to the beginning. That's where you'll find the answer. Go back before the beginning of time. But how do you do that? How do you go? We can't just go back to before the beginning of time. But of course, if Jesus said this, he would have spoken as a rabbi who would have said, well, you know how to go back and find out what happened before there was a world. You go to Genesis, which is the book of beginning, which talks about in the beginning, what happened before there was a world. The first beginning of Genesis says, in the beginning, there were deep waters and there was a wind from God, or the Spirit of God would be translated. And there's a deep chaos. And then God said, let there be light. And there was light. But the light that's talked about in that opening verse of Genesis isn't the light of the sun or the light of the moon, because the world hadn't been created yet. So this refers to a kind of primordial energy. The light is a metaphor for the energy from which God created the world. And after the coming into being of that primordial energy, Genesis goes on and talks about how the Lord creates heaven and earth and sky and water and animals and birds and creeping things on the earth, and finally humans. And Genesis goes on to say, and then the Lord made Adam, humankind, in his image. But the question that would have occurred to anyone reading the scriptures, Jewish scriptures, would say, what image? You can't make an image of the God of Israel. That's prohibited. You can't make a statue. You can't make a painting. This one, of course, made by a Christian painter thousands of years later. But this is a God you are not allowed to picture in a visible form. What kind of image of God? Well, probably the people who read these early texts understood that some of the prophets, like Ezekiel, who said he had seen the Lord, he said he had a sense of a vision of a throne of God, and on the throne he saw something like a human being. But then the prophet never says, he looked like a human being. He says, actually what I saw lightning, I saw fire, I saw jewels, I saw gleaming amber and shining radiance, brilliance, what you call in Hebrew kavod, which is the glory of God, the shining, it's radiance. So light, again, is an image you can use to speak about God. And that is what the Gospel of Thomas suggests, that we are created in the image of God means that there's a kind of energy within each one of us, which is called here the inner light, which is seen as a kind of link that connects us with the source from which we all came from the beginning of time. So in Thomas, there's a great deal of focus on this light, this energy that comes forth. And even Jesus speaks himself as if he were that light himself. At one point, there's a saying, 77, in which he says, I am the light that is before all things. Just as Jesus says in the Gospel of John, that he is the light of the world. He says, I am all things. Split a piece of wood, and I'm there. Lift up a rock, and you will find me. And here, more dramatically than in the New Testament, there's a vision of the divine energy of the world in all beings, in the sun, the stars, the moon, in all creatures, in human beings. And that's the manifestation of the same kind of energy. So in this gospel, unlike the New Testament gospels, the question isn't so much who is Jesus. The question is really, who are you and who am I? Who are we? This gospel suggests that to find illumination, spiritual understanding, the place to look is inside yourself. So there's a saying that says, within a person of light, there's light. If it's illuminated, it lights up everything. If it's not, everything looks dark. But this isn't something you believe in. This gospel isn't that kind of source. It's basically a gospel about what you can understand and find for yourself. So to understand its teaching, you have to look for that inner light. So obviously, this isn't about ordinary light. It's not about this kind of identity, the birth certificate, the passport, the driver's license, what they do is differentiate each one of us from everyone else. Birth date, name, family background, physical characteristics, anything that distinguishes you from other people, where you're from, and so forth. But in this gospel, Jesus teaches people to say, what is your other identity? What is your spiritual identity? And there's a kind of ritual moment here, like almost like a baptismal question, when Jesus says, when they ask you, where do you come from? And here it's you plural, it's not you individually. You should answer, we come from the light. We come from the place where the light came into being at the beginning of time. So this kind of identity is not about individual identity. It's actually about collective identity. It's not about how we're different, but how we're the same. We all come from the same place. And Jesus continues and says, and when they say, who are you? Say, we're children of the light, children of the living Father. And a later passage says, and our mother, the Spirit. In other words, we're all part of the same family. We all belong to each other. And all of us on that level are the same. So as we saw, it's not about what you believe in. This is how we experience our connection with a source from which we and everything comes forth. This is what this gospel suggests is the secret of the kingdom of God. When you come to know who you are spiritually, you will know that you are children of the living God. And that this gospel is attributed to Thomas, who's called the twin. And originally, some of the people who read this text said, did Jesus have a twin? I think that name here for the disciple who speaks in the gospel to Jesus is really meant to be a name for you, the reader, or any of us, the reader, or the hearer of these teachings. Because Jesus says, whoever receives my teaching, whoever drinks from my mouth, will become like me. I will become that person. It's as though Jesus is your spiritual twin. So, and that would be true for any of us if we know that we belong to the same family as Jesus. So this kind of knowledge is a different kind of knowing. It's not the kind of knowledge that you see in your mind, like conceptual knowledge, the knowledge of mathematics or physics. Greek has a word for that kind of knowledge. It means to see with the mind. We get the word idea from that. An idea is something like mathematics or physics or, that kind of knowledge. This is a different kind of knowledge. It's heart knowledge. It's the word recognize comes from that. Like, do you know that person? Do you know me? Do you know God? Who do you know? And you see that, of course, in French, Spanish, German. You have different words for knowing. One is conceptual, like in French, connaître, or, savoir, of course. And connaître is recognition. In Spanish, it's conocer and saber. In German, kennen and wissen. So these different kinds of knowledge are quite different. And this is the heart. And one of these texts, the Gospel of Truth, adds, if you know who you are, you act accordingly. You act like a brother and sister to those who need help. That's what families do. So I came to sense that the teaching of this kind of text has a paradox. It basically says we can't know the source of all life It's beyond our capacity to know. What we can know is that we're already connected with that source and with each other. At this point in my life, and this is where it gets very personal, I found that these Gospels, especially this one, helped serve a much deeper need to find meaning. It was a time when I would say meaning lost all meaning. Those are the words of this woman. Orthodox Russians call her Mary of Paris, a great saint. But she felt she lost all meaning. She lost her faith when her 6-year-old daughter died. And when it happened to me that the child that my husband and I had longed to have, were delighted when he was born, a marvelous child, was born with an illness. We were told he wouldn't live long. And he didn't. He died when he was 6 as well. And just a year later, even more unthinkably, my wonderful husband of 22 years fell to his death in a hiking accident. So everything was gone. And yet there was a moment as he and I stood in the back of the Church of Heavenly Rest in New York after the service for our son, which was almost unbearable. I wanted very much to be out of the world. I didn't want to be there. The pain was too intense. I didn't want to die. I just couldn't bear the pain of the loss of that child. And yet I had something happen, a sense of a vision. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a literal vision, but it was like a net. That's why I use an image of a spider's web. It was like there were huge ropes. And between the ropes, there were knots that were holding this great net together. And it was all over the whole scene. And I had the sense that I wanted to just disappear and go out of the world and not experience that pain at all. But the only thing holding us there were the connections between the people there, were the relationships. And that's where the message of the Gospel of Thomas, I realized, spoke to me with great power. Later, I read this remarkable book of Viktor Frankl about the worst kind of suffering anybody could imagine. About the time he spent as a prisoner in the Nazi death camp in Auschwitz. And he wrote this brilliant little book called Man's Search for Meaning, saying, he was a psychiatrist, as many of you know. He said, life is not about the search for pleasure, as Freud said. It's not about the search for power or happiness. The most important thing is the quest for meaning. He said, that is what we need more than anything else. And that is what I felt I nearly lost. As St. Mary of Paris said, when meaning lost all meaning. But there was this sense of something that the Gospel of Thomas had said about bringing forth what's within you, that just required that to happen. And one other thing Viktor Frankl said is that when you can't find meaning, and you may not find it on the ground waiting for you to pick up, many people don't, I didn't. Your task is to create meaning. So how? What you take is that experience and you do something with it to make a difference. I thought of a scene that many of us witnessed not long ago, a few years ago in Florida, when someone shot to death high school students in their class in Parkland, Florida. That's this group of people on the left, these young students who were then 15, 16. And they didn't just stop and give up. It's a horrible thing they witnessed and experienced. But they went and spoke, trying to stop the use of violent weapons. And they spoke powerfully, determined, so far as they could, to make sure this didn't happen to other people. And all of us know that when George Floyd was killed in the United States, one of innumerable deaths like his, people all over the world spoke, marched, protested, and said, it matters, no matter whose life it is, this matters, and we have to make sure that that kind of violence is prevented and can stop. St. Mary of Paris, actually, she's called that because when Nazis rounded up people in Paris, and she was living there, they rounded up Jews in the middle of the square to take them to Auschwitz. And she sneaked into that company, not being Jewish, she wasn't in danger herself, persuaded parents to allow her to hide their children in garbage bins so that when their parents were taken off to the death camps, the children would survive and she found homes for them. That was her way of creating meaning. There's many other ways that people do that. For my husband and me, it was finding children who needed parents as much as we needed children. So we adopted 2 children, and that became a way of finding meaning out of one that we didn't. This wasn't a simple recognition, because finally, I just want to talk for a moment about what prevents us, even in a time of great difficulty, from recognizing our connection with a source of our lives and with each other. And it struck me that we should talk at that moment about grief, guilt, and anger, because that has to do with the 4th question that came up, the final one. Why does it matter to think critically about our religious traditions? There are a lot of reasons. I think we could talk about them, and we will in just a moment. But one of the aspects that I think we should notice is that thinking about the religious traditions with which some of us are raised can show that some of them can be helpful and others may not. For example, guilt and anger can make the suffering of grief much worse. I'm stumbling over these words because this is a difficult topic. Guilt and anger can make it much worse than people who grieve. And I realized that biblical sources can actually intensify guilt. I'm not talking about guilt that's well-deserved when people have done something terrible. I'm talking about, for example, what happens to parents when a child dies. Almost inevitably, there is a great deal of guilt, because if you're a parent, you know your job is to keep your children alive. And if you can't do that, even though you try everything you possibly can, you feel that it's somehow your fault. And I felt that way, the kind of guilt about the so-called loss of a child. It was very deeply distressing. And I really went back to the Bible, and I was reading the story of King David and Bathsheba. And there's a famous story about how King David, married, of course, to several women, desired a woman who was married to one of his generals, arranged for her husband to get killed in the war, seized the woman, impregnated her, and they conceived a son. And the Bible says the Lord smote the infant and it died because of the sin of David and Bathsheba, because of their sexual relationship and the way it happened. And so in a way, it almost reinforces the idea that if a child dies, there's something that the parents did wrong. And that was helpful to me to understand that it wasn't just an experience I had, but it was something in the culture. Because there may be reactions culturally that we're taught from which we may need to release ourselves. Another example, for example, is that the guilt that some people have felt for sexual orientation, which is negatively perceived in many of these sources. So thinking critically about these traditions can allow us to understand and discover much more about Christianity. We can understand much more about what parts of it are helpful and constructive and spiritually nurturing and what parts aren't. And then on the wonderful side, there's a library of unknown mystical sources that are now expanding what we know about Christianity. So I'll just say a word about these for a minute and then open up our discussion. This is one other text that I just want to mention. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene. This was known in antiquity, but it was destroyed and burned by many of the Christian leaders. There's only one fragment that survived in Ethiopia, in Ethiopic, translated from the original Greek. And here you find different interpretations of Christianity that are part of the heritage of the early Christian movement that expand our understanding of what the possibilities of this tradition are. In this gospel, for example, Peter says to Jesus, "What is the sin of the world?" And in this one, unlike the Gospel of John in the New Testament, Jesus says, there is no sin of the world. Instead, sin is something you create or you make when you do something wrong. So it offers a different perspective. This gospel also suggests that Jesus spoke to Mary Magdalene that she was a disciple, and Peter gets very angry. So you see that in this gospel, among others, there are themes that are simply shut out of Orthodox Christianity. And you find this gospel echoing the theme we found in Thomas, in which Mary Magdalene says to the other disciples, "The Son of Man is within you. Follow him. Look within." One other text to mention, out of many, is the secret revelation of John, in which it speaks of the disciple John going out into the desert after the death of Jesus. He's grieving and weeping because Jesus has died. And then he says, suddenly the earth shook, and he saw a brilliant light, and a voice came out of the light, and he heard Jesus speaking to him. He says, and the voice said to me, "John, John, why do you weep? I am the one who's with you always. I am the Father, I am the Mother, and I am the Son." And reading this, I realized, wait a minute, who would you expect to find with the Father and the Son? It would be the Mother. And if we were reading in Aramaic, Jesus's language, or Syriac or Hebrew, you would understand that the Spirit of God would be a feminine word, and therefore a natural metaphor for the divine as Father, Mother, and Son, instead of the words that are translated, for example, into Greek, and it becomes a word that is not feminine, but neuter, and you don't get that same kind of image. There's much else that we could talk about, but I want to keep it short, just to say that these Gospels are not about what you believe so much as what you may recognize through your experience. Some of them say, these things have happened to each one of us. So they are an invitation to look within to your own experience. At the same time, beyond our own experience, they take us to a much wider range of interpretations of the gospel. And by the way, it's not that we should throw out the New Testament gospels and take these instead. They were actually seen as supplemental. They were seen as advanced level teaching to offer different layers of meaning. So I just want to close by saying one of the other purposes they serve is they invite us to discover what is true for ourselves and also to engage a spiritual dimension. So I wanted to close with a message from the psychologist William James, who writes about the varieties of religious experience. He says, the furthest limits of our being plunge us into an altogether other dimension of existence. So with that, I want to thank you and open up our discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pagels. Let me see if I can make it so that it's just you and me on the screen here. There we go. I think that worked.
That worked very well.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing a bit of your personal story and how it intertwines with your work as a scholar of religion. For those of you who aren't familiar with the book, I highly recommend it, of course. But one of the really amazing things and great things about it is how it weaves together your personal story with your academic story. And I think I said to you in a conversation we had before that for me that was really moving because, you know, when I think about scholars, especially scholars like yourself who have made significant contributions to the academy, I often kind of separate their work as scholars from their personal life because I don't know their personal life. But you show very, like I said, very movingly in your book, how your personal life really informed the kinds of questions you asked, how the answers you came up with in your research also kind of fed back into your life as your life unfolded as a scholar, as a wife, as a mother. And I thought that was really moving and was really helpful for me as a scholar to read an account like that. So thank you for that contribution.
Well, thank you. You know, there's a kind of taboo against scholars doing that. You're supposed to pretend that you're being objective. And
right.
we're talking about a subject that is so close to the heart and close to our experience that I wanted to acknowledge, besides the fact that my life and my work were deeply connected.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt I needed to write about these things. I just thought, why pretend?
Right.
That this is something we look at with disinterestedly. I'm really interested. You know, when somebody said, why religion? Are you religious? And I sort of thought, well, yes, I guess I just can't help being religious. But I don't mean that I necessarily believe in a specific creed or one specific way of understanding what that might mean. Mm-hmm. I think we can be open to much more than that.
Yeah, we have a number of good questions that have come in, but I wanted to ask one question of my own, which as a rock and roll fan, for those of you who haven't read the book, you might be interested to know that Dr. Pagels was friends with Jerry Garcia in his youth before Jerry Garcia became the famous Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead. So and I know actually in the story, you know, your time, the account of your time during that period, it was a difficult time for you and for him. But I'm just curious, did you keep up with Jerry Garcia through the years, or was it a relationship that ended in your youth?
Well, that happened before he was Jerry Garcia, as you said, and before I was Dr. Pagels.
Yeah.
And he had come out of the Army, and he was just playing music at various clubs and gathering around him a group of maverick friends. And our friendship deepened after the accident because it was so traumatic. Mm-hmm. That was the accident in which our close friend was killed, and another close friend of Jerry's was in it as well, who survived. The two of them did, and the driver. And I've always followed what he did, but I wasn't there. I wasn't part of that group. I was off doing something else, although aware of what they were doing. Although the close friend of Jerry, Alan Trist, and I are very close now. And that friendship was renewed after decades, and is now a very deep part of my life. So I've sort of reclaimed loving that music and all that involved in that time.
Great. Well, as a fan of classic rock, I couldn't resist sneaking in a question about Jerry Garcia. But let's move on. Let me ask you some questions that have come in from the audience. One question I wanted to ask that is actually a reflection of a couple questions that came in, but it has to do with your first point about how you said encountering religion or an experience with religion can kind of open up another dimension. And a couple of questions have come in that sort of question, you know, kind of what that might look like and what problems might even arise from that. So one audience member, Macy Wong, asks, what about those who aren't able to feel or don't feel another dimension or a new dimension when they encounter religion. And then another question that actually was submitted before the event when folks signed up from a student named Derek Wirtz. He asked, how do we square the issue of conflicting truth claims within our contemporary society? And so I see that as kind of related, right? If religion and other sorts of life experiences open up new dimensions, new ways of seeing things, what do we do when those ways of seeing things or those dimensions don't always match or come into tension with one another?
Those are really important questions. First of all, yes, I had a powerful response. That was a very emotional experience, that experience with thousands of people and the power of that experience. But, you know, Protestants particularly often put far too much importance on how you feel. You're supposed to feel a certain way. You're supposed to feel close to Jesus or whatever. And that can that can be a real demand on people. What I love about, say, the book that William James, the psychologist, wrote, he talks about the varieties of religious experience. There are many other ways that one can participate in. What I had was a sense of an openness to questions about the universe, questions about meaning. For example, if you look at Buddhism, I'm teaching a course with a colleague called Jesus and Buddha, and there, it's not about believing, it's not about feeling so much as meditation and contemplation, in which one can become aware of a larger reality. It's not a emotional born again experience, but some people find that much more their way of apprehending the divine source. William James speaks of Walt Whitman, the poet, as somebody who experienced that, or even the Stoic teacher Marcus Aurelius, that people have very different ranges of ways they speak about religious experience. It doesn't have to be feeling in that particular key. One could have a sense of an awareness that is a very quiet kind of experience, for example. As for conflicting truth claims, you know, because I study the early history of Christianity, I've become frustrated with truth claims. With, you know, do you believe in God? Do you not believe in God? Do you believe Jesus is the Son of God? Those kinds of questions come out of the 4th century when the Christian movement is formulated as the Nicene Creed, and certain books are part of it, and certain beliefs are part of it, and you're part of it if you accept a bunch of beliefs. The early movement was called the Way. It was a way to live. One of the earliest converts, Justin Martyr, says, we're people whose lives were transformed. And what I mean, he said, is we're transformed in the way we deal with money, the way we deal with sexuality, the way we deal with race. He said, we used to really value money and property, and now we share with others in need. We used to be promiscuous sexually, and now we embrace self-control and care about sexual relationships. And we used to hate people of a different race and avoid them because they weren't like us. And now we live with them as brothers and sisters. That for him was the way that he'd embraced. It wasn't about beliefs primarily. So when people's truth claims clash, for me, okay, this is just me. Some people are much more intellectually structured, that they prefer conceptual discussions about theology. I don't, because these texts go for the heart. They go for experience. They tell stories. They tell stories with which you might identify. The Gospel of Truth is almost like a poem, right? And I think it's I'm going to talk about these tomorrow. So For me, truth claims belong to theology and conceptual thinking about God. I guess I don't do that. I think there are other ways that for me are much more direct, that have to do with music, that have to do with worship, that have to do with how we act, how we experience.
So speaking of those texts, the Gospel of Truth, for example, we do have a couple of questions, or a few questions about the Nag Hammadi texts, and feel free to pass on any if you're planning to address these issues tomorrow, because we do have another event with you tomorrow that we're looking forward to. So just want to remind the audience about that as well. But Michael, it's either Spires or Spears, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing it, has asked a couple of questions about the manuscript history of these texts. And so he's curious how many manuscripts were found of these Gospels, and how do the numbers of manuscripts we have of these kinds of texts compare to those that we have of the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. So could you comment some on the manuscript history of these collections?
Oh yes, that's a complicated and interesting question. So I'll probably only mention part of it. Tomorrow I was asked tomorrow to talk more about how are these texts changing the way we understand the early Christian movement. And I'll really talk more about that. The actual texts that were found were translated from Greek originals. All the New Testament is written in Greek, although Jesus spoke Aramaic. So his words were translated into Greek, and we only know them in Greek. We don't have them in Aramaic, actually. And these texts were probably written in the 2nd century. The reason we think so is that if you look in the garbage dumps of Egypt, like at Oxyrhynchus, you will find scraps of the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of John, and the Gospel of Thomas. And those scraps probably come from the end of the 1st century, about the time the earliest Gospels were written, between the years 70 and 110 or 120, something like that. And then we don't have complete manuscripts from that time. So, but later, of course, they were copied, and they were copied many times, copied from Greek into Latin by some other Christians in the West. But these were copied into the Egyptian language of Coptic, which is an African language, and they were read and treasured in one of the oldest monasteries in Egypt, the monastery of St. Pachomius, the headquarters monastery in Nag Hammadi, about an hour from Luxor in Egypt. And these are 4th century texts that we actually have. The first time we ever had a copy of the Gospel of Thomas, we had pieces, we had little shards of it, and it's quoted in other 2nd century writers. But the first time we have copies, they come out of the 4th century and they're translated. So the manuscript and the question of the authenticity of the text is often argued on the basis of, are they genuine? Could they be early? Are they late and derivative? Did somebody make all this stuff up later? And all of these theories are now being intensely debated by scholars. I mean, I'm among the scholars who think there's a lot of authentic material there. There's 51 texts, at least 5 Gospels, and many other sources that claim to give information about Jesus and his disciples. So we have 5 volumes of text now, a huge amount of literature. It's extraordinary. And it just shows you that the Christian movement was far more expansive and diverse than we ever thought.
Definitely. And when I introduce these texts to students, that's the main point I try to make is look at how diverse these texts are in relation to our kind of general assumptions about what Christianity is and how it functions in our world today. A follow-up question to that. This question comes from a graduate student here, Melody Everest, and she asks, who do you think the audience or intended reader of a text like the Gospel of Thomas would have been? And what kind of evidence do we have for the answer to that question?
Yes, that's a very good question. And a lot of us have wondered about that. We don't really know for sure, except it's now the consensus of most scholars. There are people internationally working on this all over Europe and Japan and all over the world, Australia. I mean, the international scholars are working on this. And the closest we can come is we see that the manuscripts that were found, as I said, in an ancient monastic library after the archbishop banned those texts. Mm. So these particular texts were probably ordered by the monastery to be read by monks in their devotions. So that's what I mean when I say they were advanced level. They weren't the beginning thing. The canon, the canonical texts in the New Testament, canon means a standard. And these are the ones you're supposed to read in church and worship for everybody. But for the people who want to go deeper into the mysteries of what, say, the kingdom of God might mean, these are for people who want to go further beyond the first level of understanding what the movement is about. Did Jesus offer secret teaching? That's still a question. I think it's very likely that he did. There's quite a bit of evidence of that.
So, sorry, if it looks like I'm distracted, it's because I'm clicking lots of buttons to mute myself, unmute myself, grab the question box and see what's come in. Apologies for that if my eyes and hands are wandering all over the place. So I think you've already kind of hinted at your answer to this question, but it has a great background story as a lead-in, so I want to share it with you. This comes from an audience member, Richard Iwuk. He says, Professor Pagels, I have your book, The Gnostic Gospels, and when I had a priest staying at my house, he saw the book on the bookshelf, and he looked at me and he said, I see you like banned books. And he says, we then had a wonderful discussion as to how we ended up with the current canonical Gospels. So Richard's question to you is, do you think that if the church or churches, through all of this again, would we still end up with the same 4 Gospels in the New Testament?
Well, it's a wonderful question. Yes, this book, when I wrote the Gnostic Gospels, the review was written by the president of the American Academy of Religion, Raymond Brown. And I was a graduate student, sort of, trembling in my boots, thinking, what is this great scholar going to think? Well, he doesn't like it. Because these texts were rejected. Again, I think the purpose of Irenaeus's collection of books is to choose the books that are most widely read and that are easiest to read. Now, it's a lot easier, to read a story about Jesus and the woman at the well, or Jesus healing people or whatever, than it is to read the Gospel of Thomas, which are just these cryptic sayings. When my students read them, some say, oh, this is amazing. And some people say, what? I don't get it. So they're paradoxical. They're like Zen koans, which are, sayings that are supposed to make you think deeper. So the canon, if you're choosing books for worship in church, and that's what canon is for, you'd probably read the simplest Gospels, which are narrative stories, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the stories are about the public teaching of Jesus. But esoteric teaching was usually kept for the people, the theology students, the closer disciples, the inner circle, who wanted to go further, or who wanted to spend their time in spiritual exploration. So I don't think the church would make a different decision. One decision it might have made was to leave a canon open. There's no reason it had to be shut. Well, there is a reason institutionally. There's no other reason why it could say, you may not read these, throw these into the Nile, burn them. But that's what happened. And I think, stopping information like that is something religious people often do, and I don't like it. It's, as you can see.
So a couple of questions that I think follow well, actually, on your comments there. Faculty member here, Dominic Wojastik, asks that you, or he mentions that you say earlier that early Christianity called itself the Way. And he wonders if you think this may owe something historically to the Buddhist concept of the path, Pali Magga, Sanskrit, or the Sanskrit word Marga. Sorry, I don't know Sanskrit, so I'm probably mispronouncing all of those words. And then he says there are, as we know, several Buddhist elements in the early Christian narrative. So he's asking if you have any thoughts on potential interrelationships between Buddhism and the development of Christianity.
It's a very interesting question. I don't feel competent to answer it really, because unfortunately there's been far too little study of that. I did initiate, I think I told you, a course with my colleague Jonathan Gold at Princeton called Jesus and Buddha, and he said, I don't know much about Christianity, and I said, I don't know much about Buddhism, so let's learn. And we know that in Egypt, there were Buddhists, and Buddhist teaching was known in the time of the development of the early Christian movement. We know that Clement of Alexander spoke about the Buddha. And so these texts, some of them, and by the way, I should mention that of the 51 texts found in this discovery, most of them have Christian elements in them, but many have Jewish elements in them. Some have allusions, many allusions to Greek mythology, to Egyptian worship, to the worship of Thoth or Isis. One of them is a poem in the language of a hymn to the goddess Isis, but it also includes biblical language in it. It seems to be material that comes out of Egypt, which I think of as a very syncretistic culture, very mixed with people from many different cultures, Greek, Jewish, Roman, Egyptian, Indian. So we find these mingled together there.
There's a bit of Plato's Republic in the collection too, isn't there? Is that correct?
There's a page from the Plato's Republic. And so this wasn't limited simply to Christian texts. It was a library, I think, that monks read.
Mm-hmm.
The kinds of things that, I mean, they could easily have read Plato's Republic. These other kinds of devotional texts. There's one called Allogenes. Actually, the person who asked about Buddhism might look at the text called Allogenes, which in Greek means the stranger, the person from another race. And it's about somebody who meditates for 100 years. And then he goes to the next step, and then he withdraws, and then he meditates. And it sounds like a Buddhist path. Mm-hmm. It's very striking.
Yeah.
So I would love to see scholars of Buddhism explore some of these texts. Once I asked a colleague of mine at Columbia when I was teaching there, what would happen if you took this description of God that you find in some of these texts from Valentinus, the teacher, and you translated it into Sanskrit? And he said, oh, well, then you would find one of the tantric descriptions of God. Mm. And I said, oh, really? Mm. That was news to me. Yeah. And probably a lot else would be if I knew Buddhist tradition better.
Mm. Mm. This question comes from Fred Taffenden, who's a colleague of mine here at St. Stephen's College of the University of Alberta. And he says, thank you, Dr. Pagels, for your thought-provoking and at times very personal talk. You've offered a reading of Thomas and other gospels that amplifies, we might say, a certain spiritual impulse, one that can be shared between ancient and modern readers. In our world today, such spiritual impulses are very difficult to disentangle from modern notions of the self, which are Cartesian, individualistic, etc. How might ancient understandings of the self challenge or expand our understanding of this shared spiritual impulse?
Well, that's very well said. It's interesting. I don't find what we see in Thomas as entirely different from what you will see in other traditions. For example, in Kabbalah, those texts are written between the 10th and 15th century from Sephardic Jewish communities. Those texts like, the Book of Splendor, so forth. And they speak about how the divine light in the beginning of time pours into the darkness beyond it and is then encased in material forms of all kinds. And yet the energy, the light within them shines through, and that the person with spiritual intention, the Jewish mystic, perceives the divine energy pervading the universe, right? And it's quite stunning how those images resonate with each other. Now, some scholars of Jewish mysticism in Jerusalem, where we have relationships with the people in the University of Jerusalem and some in Tel Aviv, think that there's a continuity between what early Christian groups called heresy and Jewish mystical thought. They think there's a continuity with present manifestations of that. And others say they don't think there's a continuity because you can't trace it throughout those centuries. I don't know. Maybe these are thoughts that occur to people spontaneously in different times and places. But I think that sense of self certainly is not individual and Cartesian. It is much more, as I said, it's a sense of all of us, a collective sense of who we are and where we come from in some ultimate sense.
So we have a little bit more time here. I have a couple more questions queued up, and we received many questions. So just a reminder to everyone, thank you, or not a reminder, but a thank you to all of you for submitting questions. And I've tried to get to as many of them as I can, although we have more than we can get to in our allotted time tonight. So this one comes from Jordy Nelson, and he says, hello. And do any of the Gnostic texts contradict messages that are in the Gospels? So they're not subversive, rather they're more nuanced as books to read later, but not right away for study. I may have read that last part poorly, but I think he's mainly curious about in what ways the Nag Hammadi texts contradict maybe messages that we've come to think as normative or as standard within Christian canonical literature.
Yes, they absolutely do. And one of the examples there is that if you read the Gospel of John and it says, Jesus comes to die for the sins of the world. And the Gospel of Mary says there is no sin of them. But there are many others. That's what I'm going to talk about tomorrow. Yes, they contradict in some ways. I mean, they don't have to conflict if you can live with some ambiguity, if you can live with the fact that our descriptions of spiritual experience, whatever we mean by that, is kind of fluid and probably quite inexact, right? This is not science. Right? It's more like poetry. So, but there are definitely things that are absolutely objectionable from the Orthodox point of view. And that's what I want to talk about tomorrow. It's
yeah. So come back tomorrow, everyone, and you can hear some more on that issue.
I mean, I could mention one other I mentioned tonight is the idea of the Father, the Mother, and the Son as the manifestations of the divine instead of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit,
right.
which becomes a neuter word. That's just another example of many, but it comes right to the heart of some of the messages that I learned as an evangelical Christian, and it certainly challenges some of those.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't negate for me the experience that someone can have in that kind of church, or what I experienced there that was positive,
mm-hmm.
and that was wonderful.
Yeah.
But then that's what I mean by you have to live with ambiguity.
Right, right. So that's a good advertisement for tomorrow to hear more about the contents of these Gospels. And we dropped the links for tomorrow's registration in the chat. So for the audience, for those of you looking for registration for tomorrow, if you haven't already registered, those are there. I want to close with a question from Michael Gillingham, who's a graduate of our religious studies program here at the University of Alberta. And he would like to hear your thoughts on what you see as the future of the academic study of religion.
Well, that's a hard one. I don't know. I can speak about the present of it. I think it's very exciting and very important, especially in a world which is as connected as the world we live in. We cannot be ignorant of other traditions. It's just not even possible for anyone who's connected in any way in the 21st century. So if people are engaged with a particular tradition of their group, their tribe, their people, whatever, that person cannot be unaware of others. And how do we relate to those? I mean, often it's animosity, right? And I think the future of the study of religion can open our understanding. It can also close it. I mean, it seems to me it depends on the person, right? Some people seeing other traditions immediately want to fence off their own from all the others and say, this is better, this is right. And others are interested in looking for similarities and differences. And I think that's a great gift because it releases us from the necessity to be right and allows us to explore.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pagels, for sharing with us tonight and for this great conversation after your talk. I look forward to tomorrow. Again, for those of you who aren't registered for tomorrow's event, which is at 12:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, or Mountain, I guess we're in daylight time now. In any case, Mountain Time Zone, 12:30 p.m. The link to register is there in the chat. Before we say goodnight, I'd like to thank Kim Wiebe, the program coordinator and admin assistant at the center, for all of her work helping with the logistics and the background of this. And also I'd like to thank again Dr. Pagels. So have a good night, Dr. Pagels, and everyone who tuned in, and we will see you all again tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Thank you.